Welcome back to the class, and we are in the last week of this course. I think only 2 or 3 sessions are left. And in the previous class, we had a summary, we had a recap, we looked back most of the theories and the themes that we discussed, and we tried to understand the kind of a connection between classical sociological theory and the concept of modernity. So I emphasized again and again that this framework of modernity is something very important because it's a category, it's a conceptual category, it's a historical episode that you cannot wish away with. A category as well as a conceptual category as well as a kind of a historic moment or a historic phase which have been so significant, okay, which have been so significant in the development of the development of world societies over the last 3-4 centuries. A particular time frame, a particular category, particular kind of orientations, values, and mechanisms which completely redefined the way in which world was functioning. So we discussed that there are the kind of discussions and debates and controversies around the question of modernity is unending. Okay, even now there are the discussions and debates are raging about the meaning, its scope, and how the kind of a Eurocentric character of characterizing modernity, how that was very problematic, and how that really prevented alternative forms of knowledge making to emerge from a non-Western region, and the connection between colonialism and modernity, and how far and is it possible for the post-colonial societies, the societies which were once under the colonial rule, to reclaim their lost tradition, and is it possible for them to look back into their own culture, their own tradition, and then to retrieve categories and frameworks and theories that would be more sensitive to their own lived realities. Okay, or can you derive, or can you develop social science categories without being influenced by the kind of a modernity? And there are very different arguments and counter arguments for as well as against this particular position. So one group of scholars would say that we don't want to do anything with the Western understanding of society. We just want to completely abandon that. On the other hand, scholars would argue that these categories, simply because of the fact that they emerged in the West, does not make them useless, or does not make it worthless, but rather you need to critically adopt that. Okay, you need to critically adopt that, and also you need to develop theoretical formulations and other original ideas rooted in your own cultural specificity, and then to create, very actively engage in the process of creation of social theory from the rest of the place, from the south. Usually that's what it says, from the south. So the current academic realm or current academic scenario is quite reverberating with the kind of discussions and debates. So since we are in the final week of the class, I thought I will spend 3 hours or 3 sessions just to point at the kind of a subsequent development of sociological theory, because usually in conventional sense we understand 3 important schools of sociological theory that developed following the classical sociological period. So if you identify the period of classical sociological theory till 1930s, okay, and what we are going to discuss, the subsequent development, it follows after that from 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and by 70s and 80s they take a completely different turn with the emergence of post-structuralism and postmodern theories, and a host of new theories completely change the kind of theorization within sociology and a host of other disciplines. But from 1930s to say at least 60s and 70s, we can be very clear that these were the 3 major theoretical orientations, or 3 major theoretical traditions that kind of shaped the emergence of sociology, or not only the emergence, the subsequent development as well as institutionalization of sociology. So you must be knowing that a discipline that as young as something that was established by 1900 and 1910, 1920 became a well-established discipline across the globe. Sociology departments began to be open in most of the prestigious universities, and sociology was began to be seen as an established science, as an established discipline of society. So these development of these theoretical traditions, these theoretical frameworks really played a very important role in the establishment as well as institutionalization of the discipline. And again, by the term institutionalization, I hope you understand that there are different parameters for that. You need to have a substantial section of scholars who work in that particular field of sociology, and it must be an accepted program in different universities. You must be having a syllabus, you must be having a program, master's as well as PhD program. You must be having your professional body, you must be having your own publication, your own journals. So that is how a discipline assumes the character of a professional discipline, a well established discipline. And sociology was undergoing that particular process from 1920s, 30s, 40s, and by 60s, sociology was kind of well established across the major universities across the globe. So we are going to discuss these three major theoretical traditions. The first one is structural functionalism, and you must be knowing that we have come across this term several times, and we are not going into the details, but I would try to give a rather broad outlook or rather broad overview of this particular theoretical framework. What does it stand for? What is its kind of a primary focus? And who are the people who really contributed for the establishment of structural functionalism, and people from different countries, and what were the kind of major problems against structural functionalism. We will see that structural functionalism as a theoretical school more or less lost its steam by 1960s, because it could not really confront, or it could not really address the kind of criticisms that were leveled against this. So by 1960s, it almost died out. It almost kind of become a non-dominant theoretical perspective. But after 1980s, there is a couple of scholars who have emerged claiming to be kind of a neo-functionalists. So you see this kind of various various digressions and diverse trajectories of a theoretical discipline within the broader discipline of sociology itself. But structural functionalism has been one of the earliest as well as one of the most influential theoretical framework. So the most influential and long-standing theoretical perspective, because especially for a country like India, you will realize or you would understand that the most significant, the most influential theoretical, sociological theoretical tradition in India has been undoubtedly structural functionalism. It is not interactionism, it is not conflict theory. Conflict theory, we had few sociologists, very few sociologists who had used sorry, Marxian perspective or a conflict perspective, but very few. But vast majority of the sociologists in India consciously or unconsciously followed a structural functionalist perspective. And so is the case with the UK, so is the case with France, and majority of the European societies as well as that of the US. So it basically, structural functionalism, it tries to analyze the relationship between the structure of a society with its function. Okay, so these two terms we have come across several times, and I don't think that we need to elaborate that. So from the very beginning, from the very period of its inception, the founding fathers of sociology, especially like people like Comte and Durkheim and Weber, they compared, especially Spencer, compared a human society with that of a living organism. Just like an organism has different parts, these scholars also argued that human society also has different parts or different components. And these different components are not simply put together, but they are arranged in very, very specific manner, just like a living organism is structured, and each part is committed to fulfill certain important function. And when every part comes together, when each and every part comes together and follow their functions properly, meticulously, then that particular system or that particular animal actually behaves, or it lives, it sustains properly, or it's a state of or it's a state of being healthy. So now you understand structure as an ordered arrangement of parts, and this is an extremely important definition. So a structure is not a mere agglomeration of parts, and you know that for that holds true for any particular entity, even for a cycle or a motorcycle or a car or a house. You can't simply put all the parts together and then that only will become a heap of its parts. It will not become a structure. So there has to be an ordered arrangement of parts. And these scholars try to understand what were the specific parts and how that each part is arranged in specific relationship with other, and how that they contribute to the overall functioning of a society. Okay, so this was a very, very influential, extremely foundational line of thinking from the beginning of among the founders of sociological theorizing. So what were their major concerns? The general interrelatedness of the system's part. So you see these two terms many times interchangeably, structure and system. Okay, but usually system is understood as a step lower to that of a structure, and you understand structure as having different systems in place, and that's how even we understand anatomy, isn't it? You have or physiology for that matter. You have different systems. You have reproductive system, digestive system, central nervous system, and all these systems put together, you get the complete morphology of human beings. Okay, so similarly, they focused on the general interrelatedness of the system's part. For example, in a primitive society, how is that production takes place, and how is this production takes place along with the kind of political governance or socialization or maintenance of family and marriage and kinship system. Because each of these kinship system, what is the relationship between kinship system and the system of governance? Okay, so a sociologist who studies a tribal society would try to make sense of the interrelationship between these different kind of systems, and then try to understand that how they come together and how they act together and then take the society forward. The existence of a normal state of being or equilibrium comparable to that of a healthy individual. So the assumption was that in a society, when all these parts come together, when all these parts function properly, and the society reaches a kind of an equilibrium. Okay, there is no major chaos, there is no major change, there is no major violence. The society is in order. Society reaches a kind of an equilibrium. There is a kind of a status quo. And as we mentioned, most of these scholars were heavily preoccupied. They were really preoccupied with the question of seeing the kind of a stability. What makes the society stable? What brings equilibrium to a society? How can you maintain the status quo of a society? So they argued that just like a human society, when do we call a human body a healthy body? We call a human body a healthy body when you are able to live in a proper way without any kind of disturbances, without any kind of sickness or deformities and other things. Okay, when you are able to fulfill your day-to-day activities in the most appropriate manner, you call it as a healthy state of being. Okay, so remember the term used by Durkheim. He uses the term pathological, and this term pathological is used against the concept of healthy. When a pathogen attacks a healthy being and succeeds in attacking in its attack, then this organism loses its state of being in a healthy situation, and it becomes pathological. So similarly, so these biological imageries These biological imageries were very powerful, especially in the initial period of functional analysis. So, existence of a normal state of being or equilibrium comparable to that of a healthy individual. The way that all party tries to contribute to the maintenance of its equilibrium. So again, it was assumed, or it was taken for granted, that every part is supposed to contribute for the maintenance of this equilibrium. So that was seen as the concept of function. Function is in structural functionalism is understood not as what something does. Okay, so for example, what is the function of a switch? You know that the function of a switch is to switch on a lamp or a electrical equipment or something. That's what it does. But here in structural functionalism, the term function was understood as the kind of a very specific contribution. It has to be a positive contribution. Okay, a positive contribution for the maintenance of its equilibrium. So these scholars were heavily preoccupied with the question of understanding how that each and every part of these societies, how each of these part is contributing for the maintenance of its overall equilibrium. So though formulated from the writings of Comte, Spencer and Durkheim, structural functionalism developed through the works of British anthropologists Radcliffe Brown and Bronislaw Malinowski. So we have seen that we have not discussed this anthropologist Radcliffe Brown and Malinowski. We have not done that because they are not strictly sociologists. They were anthropologists, though you know, the relation between these two are very, very close. But if you look at the emergence of structural functionalism as a school of thought, it definitely, we understand understands its beginning with Comte, and then especially with Spencer, because of his argument about this organismic analogy, and more so with Durkheim. You know, Durkheim has very important functionalist orientation. He talks about the needs, a very problematic term. He talks about a needs that every you know, subsystem, every structure needs to fulfill, and that really, you know, created quite a lot of discussions and debates later. When you say that something is fulfilling a need, it assumes that these needs are something so original from the beginning, and then you develop a social part in order to fulfill that. It leads to a lot of questions about teleology and also to tautology for some example. Okay, so this became very powerful in the early sociological writings of Durkheim, Durkheim and Spencer and Comte. But later, it was heavily influenced by the anthropologists Radcliffe Brown and Bronislaw Malinowski, and they used it in their studies of the tribal societies. Because when you go to study a tribal society, how do you study? What is the kind of a framework that you use? So these people they used the the structural functionalist framework to understand that, because they studied primitive societies, they studied tribal societies, because they believed that these tribal societies are the most elementary, they are the most basic, so it's much easier for them to understand that. For example, they would try to see how sexual taboos function in a society, or what is the kind of a connection between sexual taboos and then kinship system, sexual taboos and you know, the governance system. Okay, so that was the kind of major you know, influence of structural functionalism during 1940s and 50s, especially with this working of anthropologists Radcliffe Brown and Bronislaw Malinowski. And then it went to US, and it became extremely powerful, a dominant theory in US through the works of Talcott Parsons and Robert K. Merton. And especially Talcott Parsons was understood as the most important scholar belonging to structural functionalism. And I'm not going into the details because Parsons' theory is very complicated. But let me reiterate that he became an extremely popular, extremely influential sociologist in the US by putting forward his structural functionalist school. So he has Parsons' theory of system levels, cultural or symbolic systems, social system, personality system, and the individual organism as a system. So he has multiple layers of system level, starting with cultural or symbolic system, and then social system, then personality system, and the individual organism as a system. So in these 3 or 4 major systems, he tries to understand a number of other concepts about his ideas about social action, his idea about pattern variables. He talks about how social action takes place at the realm of individual on the basis of various value orientations and various forms of rationality, and how that can get escalated into a social system, and his ideas about pattern variables, that certain kind of there are different kind of goal orientations. There are he talks about different types of pattern different kind of requirements for different types of societies, and I'm not going into the details, but the point why that he enters into why that he resorts into such a complicated analysis was to explain how different societies acquire social equilibrium by certain permutations between these systems levels and associated pattern variables. So let me just summarize it like that, because going into Parsonian theory is extremely complicated, and it's not required for us now. But the ultimate aim or ultimate end of Parsons was that he wanted to explain how different societies acquire social equilibrium by certain permutations between these systems levels and associated pattern variables. So he has this elaborate schema in which he would categorize societies into traditional societies and modern societies, and then attribute and then argue that traditional societies have such and such system levels, and it has a corresponding kind of pattern variables, whereas modern societies have different kind of different types of social systems with corresponding level of corresponding kind of pattern variables. So you essentially argue that okay, traditional societies are like that and modern societies are like that. So it provides a very interesting influential sociological explanation to explain why that certain societies have become developed so fast while other societies stagnated. Okay? And this is a very problematic explanation. When you try to look at society's internal dynamics and say that okay, by nature a traditional society or a society in Africa are like that because their orientation, their value orientation, their system levels, their personality, social and cultural systems are like that, which do not allow them or which do not encourage them to develop. Whereas on the contrary, societies like Europe are more different. Their cultural, social and political personal systems are different. Their pattern variables are different, and they are more inclined originally. Okay, naturally they are more inclined to become developed. It's quite natural. So this is what he explains. Okay, so this becomes a very, very important justification for the modernization theory. Okay, this becomes a very important justification for modernization theory as well as your development theory, because modernization theory explains why that certain societies have become modern while others are lagging behind. Okay, so at the same time, he was heavily criticized for not addressing the question of social change sufficiently. Now, like every structural functionalist, Parsons also is preoccupied with the question of analyzing the phenomenon of social equilibrium, okay, or social stability, or the order. And once you have a theory that preoccupied with explaining why that order is constructed and maintained, then it becomes very difficult for you to explain how social change happens. So there were serious criticism against Parsons, and towards the end of his life, Parsons also brought out a theory, a structural functionalist theory to explain social change, but was not very effective. And moreover, he was criticized for accusing the third world nations for their lack by being oblivious to the process of colonialism and slavery. And this is something extremely important. This is something extremely important. So as I told you that this structural functionalism as propounded by Parsons, it became a solid, very sociologically sophisticated theoretical justification to modernization theory. Okay? And modernization theory argues that there is only one path towards development, and that path is being shown by countries of Western Europe. All others are supposed to follow. And it also explained why that certain countries are continue to be lagging behind, why that certain countries continue to be underdeveloped, while certain countries have become developed. And if you use Parsons' argument, you can very well explain a sociological, you can provide a sociological explanation, arguing that, okay, these traditional societies, they have value systems, they are social systems, they have personality systems which are not inclined for this kind of change. They are by general, okay, resistant to change. They are more traditional, they are more inward looking. Okay? Whereas modern societies, European societies, in essence, okay, by its very nature, they are more flexible, they are more dynamic, they are more open-minded, they are more rational, whereas traditional societies are irrational. Yeah, so he brings in quite a lot of these binaries. Now the point is, this argument was very powerful in the US as well as in the development circles, at least till 1960s. And later, very interesting theoretical arguments, say from world system theory by Immanuel Wallerstein, and dependency theory by a series of Latin American scholars, Gunther Frank and others. So they very vehemently criticize this position, saying that the supporters of structural functionalism, you are not really bringing in history. Okay? You are not bringing in history to explain and to understand why that certain countries have become poor and why that certain countries have become rich. Where is the place for colonialism and slavery in your theory of social change? How do you account for that? Why don't you account for that? And that was a devastating criticism. They could not answer that. Because if you are not able to bring in a very specific, concrete historical episodes into your sociological theory and then try to explain why that we developed and you did not develop, then it's a very very baseless argument, isn't it? It's a very useless exercise. It only becomes a kind of intellectual exercise in vain. So that were the kind of criticisms that were raised by these scholars like Wallerstein and Gunther Frank and others. And another important scholar belonged to this school was Robert K. Merton, a very important sociologist who made this theories of middle range a very important one. His arguments about science and society are very important because he did not believe in making this very grand theorizations like Parsons, but he emphasized on doing more empirically based theories of the middle range. And his arguments about dysfunctions and manifest and latent functions and dysfunctions became important, because till then every part was seen as supposed to be giving only positive contributions for the existence of a society. Nothing was seen as negative. Okay, so that had led to quite a lot of teleological explanation. It looks as if every part understood what is the kind of a need it is supposed to perform and then developed for that. That's a kind of a teleological explanation. Okay, but he brings in the whole question of dysfunction. Dysfunction is the kind of a contribution from one part by the part of a society which disturb this kind of an equilibrium, and that he argued it could be both manifest and latent. Manifest is something that is obvious and something that is intended, whereas latent is something that is not seen and also unintended. Many of the social parts or many of the social structure, it generates a lot of very obvious whatever we wanted, and it also creates a lot of unwanted, unintended consequences which will disturb the equilibrium of society. So that was a very influential idea, and this whole idea of latent and manifest function is something very central even to the modern theorization, because a host of our own inventions and ideas, we wanted certain positive outcomes. Okay, those were the intended outcomes that we wanted, but while we created that, we also created a lot of unintended negative consequences, which we don't know how to deal with it. Okay, and yeah, so by mounting criticism against functionalism by 1960s, as I mentioned, and by 1960s, it more or less it failed as a theoretical tradition, it could not really withstand the kind of criticisms leveled against that by other scholars, and also a host of alternative theoretical paradigms were emerging in the US as well as in the UK, in interactionism, exchange theory, then social conflict theory, feminist theory, a host of other things were emerging. And but now from 1980s onwards, you see a group of scholars who call themselves as neo-functionalists, Jeffrey Alexander and Niklas Luhmann. Jeffrey Alexander is from US, and then Niklas Luhmann is from Germany. So they try to they try to recreate the functionalist school and calling it as a neo-functionalism, and arguing that there is much possibility still left in the kind of a functional theorization, and they don't want to look at it as a very conservative theoretical tradition, but they argue that this whole idea of differentiation and how the whole question of different social structure, it's something very, very important. I'm again not going into the details, okay, but these people, they something like a neo-Marxism that emerged during the same time. Luhmann and Jeffrey Alexander, they represent the rise of neo functionalism in the academic circle related to structural functions. Okay, so this is a very broad overview of structural functionalism, as I mentioned, to tell you, to give you an indication about what were the kind of trajectories of sociological theorization after the period of classical sociological theory. So we will stop here, and then we'll meet for the next class, and we will discuss conflict theory as well as symbolic interactions. Thank you.